First, we're going to have a keynote speech delivered by Miss J.H. Prynne.
It's wonderful to be here. I saw the blue sky this morning and I assumed it must be some mistake. However, it looks real enough. It's good to be with familiar faces and in a place which I have come to know and for which I have much affection. And I have, for this morning's talk, a small, quite limited subject. It is nothing more or less than poetic language in the history of the current situation of the East and the West, and indeed the whole planetary situation. A small topic, easily managed in a couple of sentences. I'm sure I shall enjoy dismissing it with scarcely a passing thought. It is a remarkable feature, if we think of it historically, as for a moment we shall, in order finally to put history to one side. It is a remarkable feature that there are, at the present time, two great poetical traditions on the planet. One of them is the English poetical tradition, and the other, of course, is the Chinese. And if I were speaking justly, I should put them the other way around, because the Chinese tradition is older and deeper and has a much more complicated origin than the English. It's worth noting in passing that the American literary tradition is a mere teenager. It's scarcely begun. It borrowed most of its initial forms from its colonial origins as an offshoot of English culture, and now it is struggling to find its way in the world. And perhaps in 500 or 1,000 years it might become a mature culture. At the moment it's merely a partial one. So we can set the whole of American culture to one side. It is not a serious player in this game. We're talking now of a serious and deeply rooted, complex cultural accomplishment on the English side and on the Chinese side. And the relations between these two are complicated and deeply interesting. The Chinese literary culture is not the one that has enjoyed the longest continuous active span in planetary history. That honour goes to the Babylonian culture. The Babylonian literary language ran for longer than the Chinese one has yet done. Though if the Chinese one goes on for some 1,000 years or so more, it may catch up with the record of the Babylonians. However, let's set the Babylonians on one side too, because they are now nothing more than ancient history buried under the residues of American tanks, poor things, and maybe they will survive this terrible ordeal, or maybe they won't. But not much has been heard recently of the current developments in Iraqi poetic language, more to shame to the rest of the world that it should be so. If then we restrict our attention to the English and the Chinese traditions, now I'm going to say it correctly, the Chinese and the English traditions, we do recognize some very deep contrasts, as well as some surprising and intriguing similarities. We have in both cases the complex interaction between a written culture, which is essentially a culture of a literate class, and the historic development of certain social forms associated with a minority literate class, and a popular culture of spoken language, the language of song, of everyday activity, and of cultural activities like dancing and making lists and enjoying the company of your friends. And singing and dancing and various kinds of popular practice, to which the word ceremonial is probably too grand, are part of the lifeblood of a spoken oral language in its natural cultural setting. And this contrast between a written language and a spoken cultural practice is to be found in both language systems, both the Chinese and the English. The Chinese written system has fascinated the English literate classes ever since the beginning of the last century because of the extraordinary power of your written script the extraordinary suggestiveness of how your written script records and notates the spoken form of Chinese oral practice. We have an alphabet and you don't. We have dictionaries arranged in the order of the headwords, and as I discovered painfully when attempting to learn your language, the use of a Chinese dictionary is a very arcane art and requires a great deal of special practice before you can perform the simplest activity in looking at a single word. So you have an extraordinary written system, not unique. Other languages in the Orient have written systems of this kind. But actually the Chinese language is not so different from the English if you compare it to some even more outlandish languages. The agglutinative languages like Eskimo, for example, are constructed on an even more unfamiliar basis than either Chinese or English, since Chinese is in some sense an SVO language, that's to say a subject-verb language, and the relationship of that kind of primitive basic grammar gives the English learner a kind of starting point in what is not altogether unfamiliar. These are very general remarks, and we've scarcely yet spoken about poetry. So we should, in order to speak about poetry, move from the very general to the very particular. I want just to remind you of one of the very famous poems of one of your Tang Dynasty poets, which I'm going to read to you, very short, in English, and my translator has purposely not been given any advance notice of this poem, so he won't be able to give it to you in Chinese. Some of you may know this poem because it is so celebrated, but my access to this poem is through this English version, and I would like to share with you some thoughts about this English version from an English, that's to say, an external viewpoint. It's a poem by Meng Haozhan, as I say, sufficiently famous in your great history. And Meng Haozhan was, as nearly everyone in this room will know, an earlier contemporary of the great Tang poets, Wang Wei, Li Bai, and then a little later, Wu Fu. This is a poem which is translated under the title Passing the Night on a River in Qiantu. Do I see some eyes light up? They should be lighting up by now. I guide my boat to mooring by a misty inlet. With the setting sun, a traveller's sorrows revive. Wild so vast, the sky stoops to the tree. The river so clear, moon close to man. Let's pause for a moment about this remarkable, beautiful, and complex short piece. It's a very familiar traditional subject. It is the lonely poet, far from home, on some travels, no doubt of displacement from his natural place, from his home and his family, out in a strange location, on his travels, confused and unhappy to be alone and, in some sense, separated from his natural place. And in this mood of separation, he glances around the empty, desolate landscape, which is his temporary resting place. And it's strange, is it not, that this misty inlet in which he has stopped, where everything that could be seen around him is obscured by the water vases, suddenly becomes, in this last line, the river so clear, moon close to man. Have these water vapors, these clouds, parted for a moment to reveal a clear sight of the river? How has the river become clear? How does he understand now what the river means and what he can see when he looks out over the expanse of this empty, lonely, watery landscape? How can he catch this glimpse of the moon in the sky? And how does he feel the sky come down almost to the level of the trees around him, so that the sky momentarily touches the canopy of the earth? And how does he feel the moon itself so close that he can almost touch it? The translation is expert. It was not always so. It was done by a scholar, American I believe, called Paul Crow, and I followed the evolution of this short translation of this short poem through a number of drafts. And his first draft was very clumsy, and his final draft is quite magical and has all the power of poetic creation. It would be even better if he had said not "the river so clear," but "river so clear." There is no need for the definite article here. I would strike it out just as coarse as the pound would have struck it out. We don't need to be told it's the river because this is the only river. It's the only river in sight, and therefore it's every river. And therefore, as a river, it needs no introduction and no placing. Just as in the final phrase, with impeccable purity, the translator says, "Moon close to man." Moon close to man. And what the translation has also done is, with great skillfulness in the pausing and the management of little movements of emphasis, has broken this final sentence into two, into a pair, a kind of couplet. River so clear, comma, moon close to man. It is, of course, a couplet in the traditional paired form, because the previous line breaks in the same way. Wild so vast, the sky stoops to the tree. Why do we know, without a shadow of doubt, that this is true poetic language? Why do we know that such a thought could not be expressed in prose and could not be expressed in music or painting? It belongs in the essential domain of the power of poetry. What is powerful about it and what is true about it? This brings me to some central aspects of my minor topic. What do we value and what do we recognize as distinctive about the language of poetry? First, I must disentangle an uncertainty about what this phrase means. The language of poetry is either the language which is inside poems used in their composition, or it is the language that poets use, which they have as their repertoire, as their place of operation, as their workshop, and everything that goes on around them in the world of language, which is part of their equipment and their knowledge. Here let me pause and introduce another slightly rivery, watery aspect. Consider the situation of fish. Consider the fish in the streams and lakes who move about in the water because the water is their natural element. Everywhere they go is water. If they find themselves out of water, then in a short time that will be the end of their existence, and since it is Guangdong province, they will almost certainly end up on a plate somewhere. Very nice too. Your fishy menus are absolutely out of this world. But if you're a fish, you don't look forward to that aspect of things very much. In fact, you don't do a lot of looking forward, because although water is your element, you know nothing of it. You have no knowledge of your element. You simply naturally move and swim in it. It is your world, it is the condition of your world and the limit of your world, and of it you have no knowledge or power of knowledge. Poets move and swim about, sometimes with the stream and sometimes against the stream, in language. And here they differ from fish because they know what they are doing. They know the element they are in. They can even survive outside language for short periods, though no doubt they gasp pretty much if the removal is prolonged. Every poet requires his daily dose of natural language to replenish his storehouse of horrors, and so the press and the TV and all the rest of the normal practice of degraded and corrupted language are absolutely essential to poets, and they're particularly so because they give poets the task and the power of knowing where they are and knowing what they do. It means that unlike fish, we know where we are and what we have to do in the world of language. What makes the use of language that poets make distinct? Well, there are many things that could be said here, and I'll mention only two. The first is radical economy. That is to say, poetry is shorter than prose. If you're a printer, you know perfectly well that when you set poems on the page, you don't need so much type. You need quite a lot of paper, but you don't need so much ink. You don't need so much type. There is all that delicious wasted space all down the right-hand side. Or I suppose if you're setting up type or writing things out of the traditional Chinese way, all down the left-hand side. That is to say, it is economic with the presence of words on the page and places these words in an estranged environment of white text space all around them. This economy is strongly and deeply felt by writers and by readers. It means that great power can be invested in patterns of repetition and of all the devices which give poetic language its extremely organized, managed and coherent internal and structural shaping. This is characteristic probably of all poetic traditions on the planet now and in the past. It is an intensely shaped activity, and the shape essentially consists in leaving things out, in compressing and condensing, so the record becomes acutely symbolic and displaced. Nothing is complete, nothing is entire, nothing is fully and totally recorded. The construction of sense or of the presence of language is made by the reader as a kind of act of restoring, of completing the notation which is set out by the poet on his or her page. The other aspect I'll mention is truthfulness. A community pretty much depends for its poets on the survival of truthfulness. Let's try and distinguish, since some of you are dependent on dictionaries, the way that I too am when I'm in a foreign language, between truth and truthfulness. Truthfulness is an attitude and a performance, a stance and an accomplishment that people can do when they understand the power of truth and work with it and for it. It is essentially a human act. Truthfulness is the stance of those who know what truth means and why it's important to them. Truth is an abstract idea and could, so far as I know, exist in a glass cube without human intervention. But truthfulness requires people to do it. And it is not done by people, it will certainly not be done by fish. And as it won't be done by fish, if it is not done by people, it will be done by no one.